Greetings, listeners. When law firms meet capital markets and AI hits legal talent, not all money or strategy looks the same. In this episode, Burford Capital Vice Chair David Perla joins Howard and I to unpack how litigation finance, private equity, and permanent capital are reshaping law firms, talent, and the future of the industry. Enjoy. Welcome, everyone, to the Future is Bright podcast. My name is Chris Batz, and joined by my co-host, Howard Rosenberg. Howard and I are at the center of law firm talent and strategic growth here in New York City. Howard is a partner and the head of talent intelligence and acquisitions at Barrett & Burnell, and I advise and facilitate law firm M&A and PE investments at Columbus Street. And today, we have a very exciting guest, David Perla, Vice Chair of Burford Capital. David, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Chris. Great to be here.
David, if you would do me a favor and provide my audience just a quick overview of your role right now at Burford.
Absolutely. So I'm currently Vice Chair of Burford Capital. My remit is fairly broad and fairly diverse. It includes public policy, communications, public relations. It overlaps with marketing, so all of our public-facing functions. And I also have an active role working with our development office, which is what we term all of our non-core litigation finance investments. So that includes legal tech investments, direct and in funds, that includes law firm equity, and that includes investments in managed service organizations.
Excellent. So David, just out of the gate, I just happened to notice you cut your teeth on Big Law. Was it Catton that you started with?
Yes, at what was then Rosenberg and Colin, and then merged into Catton Muchin. So I spent nearly 5 years as an M&A lawyer in the 90s.
Did you? Amazing. But it seems like you quickly went in-house and took on various roles. What got your interest to do more of the business side?
So I had what looks to be a fairly typical career in hindsight, which is nearly 5 years as a corporate lawyer in the 90s. In my mind, it was one of the greatest times to be a young lawyer. It was the sort of the dawn of Internet 1.0, really happened in 94, 95. So I started in 1994. And by the late 90s, by the time I was facing the decision, do I want to stay and make partner, there was just so much excitement around what the Internet and technology could do that, to paraphrase what a friend said to me, was if I'd been alive during the Renaissance, I'd like to think I would have at least tried painting. And that's what it felt like. And I had the opportunity to go in-house at the parent company of Monster.com, which was a very fast-growing job board and resume board at the time. They were looking for someone who understood the Internet and technology, but also understood M&A. So it was really a perfect fit. It was exactly what I wanted to do and exactly what they needed. And I ended up spending 5.5 years there as a result.
And David, if I start at the beginning, why did you want to go to law school and become a lawyer before the Catton and the trek that you got through?
Yeah, we have to go to the Wayback Machine, Howard.
Yeah, I know.
So I was one of those kids who, if you'd asked me when I was young what I want to be, I would have said a lawyer, and I had no idea why or what that meant. So for me, it was always a path. I was a reasonably good student, and throughout college, I just sort of had the expectation I would go, and again was very fortunate, and I went to a law school that, number one, is very interdisciplinary at the time and more so now. And also, for the most part, sends their graduates into large law firms. And so I followed a well-trodden path. I veered from that well-trodden path 10 years into my career by founding a company. But at the time, I sort of always expected I would go to law school. The main difference, Howard, would be, if you'd asked me when I was young, I would say, I'll be a courtroom lawyer. It was in law school I discovered I really liked corporate and finance and the math side of law.
And so you were part of Pangea. Talk us a little bit about that journey, being at Pangea and then also selling to Thomson Reuters.
Sure. So in many respects, Chris, I am a creature of what people will call luck. We call it the intersection of hard work and opportunity. I I spent 10 years practicing, nearly 5 at the law firm and over 5 at Monster. And somewhere kind of 9 years in, so a year before I left, I sat down with my then best friend from law school, Sanjay Kamlani, and he had gone in-house at a client of his that was a startup outsourcing company in India. I was in-house, and we had been exposed to entrepreneurs, and we had seen the best of what entrepreneurship brings, and both had caught the bug in some respect, but weren't sure what the idea was. But we were both sure we wanted to start businesses by sometime in 2003, and we also were exposed to people who, to be frank, were very encouraging. A lot of people were saying to both of us in separate conversations, you have what it takes to start a business, which I think a lot of lawyers reflexively think they don't. They think there's some magic or some training you need to be an entrepreneur. That's changed, but at the time, 20 years ago, certainly lawyers didn't think that way. And we sat down and started spitballing ideas, and ultimately came up with the idea that what we really knew how to do was law, technology, and recruiting. Based on kind of what we had done for the last 10 years, we had an incredible network and expertise in India, primarily through Sanjay, but I'd also done a lot of business there, and I'd been there already at that point. And we came up with the business plan, and then it took about 8 months, and we quit our jobs. But it really was, I would say, exposure to entrepreneurs while buying companies, in Sanjay's case, working for 2 guys who had quit, prestigious investment banks to start a company.
And what was that investment process like in the early days? Because you kind of were pioneering a business that never really kind of went through this process before, right?
It's such a fun question for me, Howard, because no one had really done it in legal, and the investment environment looked different. There was no such thing as a safe in 2004. No one had the concept hadn't been invented on the West Coast yet. So everyone was doing sort of traditional seed round preferred equity investments. At the time, I knew how to do those. I had represented a lot of startups in the course of my practice in the law firm. So it had been 5 years, but I really knew how to do those deals. And we had a reasonably good network. By the time we left our jobs, each of us had 3 or 4 professional colleagues who had committed to invest, and enough friends and family that we felt certain we could invest. But to really answer the question, what we learned along the way was none of that really matters. At the end of the day, when you ask someone to take $1 out of their pocket and give it to you, you're going to learn what's wrong with your business model. And what ours really depended on, what people really wanted to see, because we were an outsourcing business, was who was on our team, who had committed to join the company. And so we really started the company in earnest in August of 2004. And it was only 6 weeks later we got on a plane to India to go recruit. That was really what it all depended on. And once we proved to people we had the team, it really wasn't hard to convince clients to at least try us. And it wasn't hard to convince people to invest in us, understanding that, statistically, likely to fail. Most startups do. So we didn't hide that fact. And, we had to negotiate. We found a lead investor, but that part I knew how to do. I want to sort of maybe address a question you didn't ask, but I think it's a valuable one. I think today's environment, in some respects, is not healthy for entrepreneurs. The valuations have gotten too high, and they force the entrepreneurs to, once they get through their seed round, to try and either not raise more money because they're trying to keep they don't want to do a down round, or to try and get revenue growth rates or ARR growth rates that they're not ready for. And I don't think it's a good dynamic. I tell a lot of entrepreneurs, it's okay if your valuation is a little lower. Take the pressure off yourself. I appreciate you don't want to be diluted, but it's too much pressure to raise money. I see startups at they're capped at, let's say, $25 or $30 million, which they think becomes their valuation, and it's not sustainable. for the bulk of companies.
Well, let's stay on the arc of your career at the moment, because so Pangea 3 sold that to Thomson, and then you wound up at Bloomberg. So what happened there? Did they find you? You found them? What was the motivating reason to kind of join Bloomberg?
So they found me. I spent 2 years at Thomson Reuters very happily. We sold our business. We understood it was their business after we sold it. We had a happy post-exit relationship. We remain happily friends with many people at Thomson Reuters. And by the way, I attribute that for both of you guys to us being transactional lawyers, is we know how to get along with people, but we also understood when someone buys your company, it's theirs. It's not yours. It's not your child. It's a company, and they're going to largely do things you disagree with. So we knew that. We knew that intellectually and emotionally. And then we were done. And I thought I would spend the rest of my career doing startup things. And my phone rang in January of 2014. So it was a year after I left Thomson Reuters. It was a recruiter asking about Bloomberg Law. We had known about the product because the work to build the database was actually done in India by a competitor of ours. So we knew the product, and we just started chatting. And over the course of a 5-month process, I became convinced, one, I could do the job, but also there was an experience set that I didn't have. I was 44 years old at the time, and the part of my experience that I had never done was I had never run a large unit at a large company. I sold Pangea 3 to Thomson Reuters, but that's very different than coming in and having 420 odd people reporting at a company like Bloomberg. And I'd never really worked at a place like Bloomberg, which, if you grow up in New York, it's practically a household name. So for me, it was really too good to pass up, even though I'd always thought I'd stay on the entrepreneurial side.
Well, that really next big move is where you are today, being that you're at Burford. I'd love to hear that story, getting to Burford and your trek. I mean, you were there about a year and a half before COVID happened, but yeah, I'm just curious about that journey.
So Burford may be the perfect fit, which explains why I'm going on 8 years here and I'm vice chair. I started out as managing director, became the co-chief operating officer in January of 2020, and we did a reorg to break down all the geographic barriers right before COVID. So a lot of things sort of worked out, but Burford was looking for a role that I would describe as highly unique, almost idiosyncratic. That was a function of Burford having bought a private fund called GKC back in 2016, and the three founders, one of whom is now back, Travis Lankner is now back at Burford, but the three founders had brought particular skill sets, and then at the end of 17, they left, and Burford recognized that it wanted to replicate some of those skill sets and went out to market to find them. And I met Chris Bogart, who's a fascinating person and kind of a remarkable founder, public company CEO. And we sat down on a couple of occasions. I met a bunch of the team, and it was really something he said to me that convinced me to come work back at what was then a UK listed public company. Now we're listed in New York and in London. I was sort of happily doing stuff with Sanjay again. I was doing entrepreneurial. I was making money. I was not an unhappy person in my life. And he, at the end of the second meeting, he said, "Oh, come on, David." He goes, "You're bored. I can see it right now." He goes, you need to be knee deep, 5 days a week, sleeves rolled up, building something and breaking things." And I got in the car home and I called my wife and I said, he's kind of right. He just picked up on, to the extent I was happy, it was not going to last very long, just sort of being out in the market. And here was this cool opportunity. It was a platform, wanted to continue what was a very fast growth trajectory, populated by the smartest people in the legal business, and legal smart, but Burford is really, really smart. And that was appealing to me to come in. And it was also having been at two large organizations, for the past few years of my life, 2 years at Thomson Reuters, 2.5 at Bloomberg. At the time, Burford was, oh gosh, I don't know. We were sub 100. So that was really appealing to be at a company that had capital and had the platform, but was quite a small business. So just made a lot of sense.
So, David, I am infinitely curious about Burford, infinitely curious about your role and what you guys are up to. And I would love for you to kind of take our audience into the inner room of Burford. How do you guys look at the legal industry? How are you guys sizing it? Because you were very active in litigation finance, and then you guys have been very public about investing in law firms. And I'd love for you to share perspectives that other people don't see.
Sure. So maybe I can break the business down into two sides. One being the core business,
yeah,
and one being what we roll under our development office, or future of law, future of Burford. In the core business, we have a very rigorous, almost religious way of underwriting litigation risk, and we will find every way to value, finance, and monetize legal and litigation risk. I think we're really creative. We're probably not surprised that there are fewer players now than there were some years ago. We think it was overpopulated, but we think that the good players are now left, and we think it's in a good place. Core litigation finance, it continues to grow. Our business continues to grow. We continue to innovate. We find new things to put capital against and to value. So that we try to innovate, but that remains the core of the business and what people are investing in. And we can spend all day talking about it, but I won't, unless you want to come back to it. All the ways we put money to work in the litigation finance market. On the other side of the business, our leadership, starts with Chris Bogart, but also John Mallow, our chief investment officer, has been a long time advocate for innovation in the use of capital in law. So if you look back, John was writing about law firm equity 15 years ago. The idea of using an MSO, he was writing and talking about that long before I arrived at Burford 8 years ago. And we were working on those deals before it was really a household conversation. On top of that, the business and the management of the business has always been interested in non-core investments. So we are today invested in at least 2 legal tech funds and any number of individual companies that are either follow-on investments or direct investments in legal tech. That's in part because Burford itself was born as an innovative legal business. And so we have a comfort with that and a desire to be in those business. And in part because we're in the business of risk. And so we understand risk, and we can value risk, and we can invest in risk. It is not yet the core of our business. I don't expect it will become a majority of the business, but the embrace of non-litigation finance investing has always been part of Burford's DNA. It's always been something that management talked about. When I joined, one of my remits as a managing director, at the time, my remit was business development, marketing, policy. But one of the remits was keep an eye on everything else in the market that's happening, keep an eye on the startups. This was long before people were talking about AI. These were the sort of days of CLM and e-discovery. So it's always been part of what we do. And I think people often misunderstand Burford and think, well, we found our way to it, or we're just trying to find other ways to put capital to use. From the moment I started talking to Burford, this has been an interest of the business, and they were in other startups at the time. There were private deals that they had done that were made long before I joined up 8 years ago.
So, David, if Chris and I gave you a magic, kind of a magic ball, crystal ball, like walk us through, you must have made bets. I mean, you're making bets in the future here. So, what does the future of the non-core side of the business of Burford look like in the industry?
On the non-core side, I think we feel very good about Burford's ability to make private investments in law firms and law firm adjacent businesses. So by law firm adjacent, the most obvious are managed service organizations, but there are plenty other adjacent businesses. So there are ALSPs, there are staffing agencies, all these names and terms now bleed into one another. But I think our ability to invest in them is extremely high relative to, let's say, traditional private equity. We have different parameters. We also have the flexibility to make investments where we're not looking to flip those. So we've been invested in a British law firm called PCB Byrne since 2020. We're a minority investor. We're passive. It's a very successful investment. There's no mandate to sell that business. There's no mandate for someone else to come in and take us out, a sponsor deal. We're an investor in an MSO called Kindleworth. These are publicly known deals. Again, minority investment, passive, non-control. We are, in that case, they may come into the US and do business here. We are free to make other MSO investments. We're free to make other law firm investments. Obviously, in the US, Howard, they'd have to be made through MSOs. That's its own conversation whether the US system is healthy or unhealthy in terms of capital. But I think we are uniquely situated to be a permanent partner. And that's how most of the people who have our capital view us on the non-core side of the house.
Well, let me reframe the question. What does life look like in 10 years that it doesn't look like now? I mean, is it a substantially rewritten kind of chapter in the evolution here, or are you after, are you more, I don't know, are you bullish, or like where are you on that spectrum?
Yeah, we're very bullish institutionally. I'm very bullish personally. Is it a different chapter? Depends on whether we're talking about the law firm market or Burford. I think for us, we'll do a lot more of them. We'll do a lot more at numbers that, we have a substantial amount of capital. We raise money in the public markets. And so we're going to be able to deploy more and more of it into either law firms directly in jurisdictions that allow it, or into law firms via MSOs in the United States, or just into MSOs directly and because we like them as businesses and other similarly situated businesses. I think for those businesses, they are going to obtain private capital. What I think is going to look very different is, I think your growing law firms and your smaller boutiques are going to be your early movers. You're going to see a lot of action there in the next 3 to 5 years. If I had a crystal ball, Howard, do I think you're going to see any critical mass of AmLaw 100 or 200 firms doing private equity deals? I do not. I think you'll see a few if they want to for different reasons, but it will require taking equity from players that are used to control, whether it's real control or whether it's control via financials or via covenants. I'm a corporate lawyer. I know there are ways to get control without having the voting control. So on the capital side, it will require terms that law firms are going to struggle to get comfortable with. And on the private equity side, institutional size private equity, checks of 300 million to a few billion, it will require agreement from partners that will be so difficult to obtain, other than from firms that are where all the equity is owned by somewhere between 1 and 5 individuals. But that's not your average AmLaw 100 law firm. So I think those are going to be far fewer and further between. But the boutiques, and some of them are very large, where they are controlled by one, two, or three individuals. I think you'll see a lot of capital moving into that space. And by the way, if you look at how litigation finance has evolved, functionally, litigation finance is now used to help law firms get what otherwise look like equity investments. They just happen to be litigation only law firms. So we have plenty of relationships. When you deconstruct those capital agreements, we're not voting equity members, but it behaves like an equity investment in terms of how it performs.
David, could you describe to us your ideal investment, and what's your scorecard? Because when we were talking, you were mentioning the really large law firms are probably not ideal. And I know you're a minority investor. You mentioned passive. Can you describe that in real dollars?
Sure. I think for starters, it doesn't have to be a litigation only firm.
Okay.
People think in those terms, and one of the reasons we have so many investments, that are litigation finance deals in litigation firms is because the collateral is the expected proceeds from the case. But by all means, if we were to do a deal in Britain, or if we were to do an MSO style deal here in the US, it could be a corporate firm or a general practice firm. We love diversification of revenue. We love diversification of collateral. And so it could easily be one of those. I think, for us, it's going to match the check size that we're used to writing. So on a litigation finance deal, we really don't do much smaller than 5 to 10 million. I think on an equity investment, same numbers hold is pretty easily done. On up to, I think within an equity deal, certainly there's going to be a comfort level in the 50 to 100 million, and add whatever currency you want. Beyond that, I think, would we do it? We could. We certainly have the capital. We certainly, we regularly do litigation finance monetization deals of over $100 million. Those, we're public about that. We've done north of 200 million. I think to do a law firm equity deal, we wouldn't start at those numbers. Those would be the later deals. So, 2026, 2027, I think the deals would be a more modest size. And then in later years, I think would go closer to what our litigation finance investments look like in those 9 figures. But I think today, if someone wanted to do a steep 9-figure deal, you're looking at more traditional private equity. The other thing, by the way, we're pretty open about, our desire to acquire businesses. And I think if we were to acquire a legal adjacent business, those would easily be in north of $100 million. I think we would anticipate, we're open about that also, that we look at a lot of deals. The bankers know us. We're active in the space. We think we're a unique buyer of those businesses because we really understand the legal market, as opposed to being a traditional sponsor, like a private equity sponsor. We could buy a business like that and own it without any plan for exiting it or selling it at some multiple, which is how private equity looks at everything they do. It's not a dig, by the way, as someone who's on a private equity owned company board and has been on one that exited, both in the legal space. There's nothing wrong with private equity. It's just a different exit expectation. We come in without a built-in desire to exit a business in somewhere between 3 to 6 years. That's your private equity horizon.
David, what keeps you up at night?
Well, I have 3 kids, so it's a sort of a trick question, Howard. But in the market, I think what keeps me up at night is really 2 things, both of which are dislocations that are happening very, very fast with consequences that we can't predict. So one is artificial intelligence and how it will impact the legal industry writ large, but particularly talent, something near and dear to your heart, Howard. And the second, I'm on the advisory board at my law school, and I think the market for young talent, which ripples across the whole business, but particularly in large law, is changing much faster than law firms or people like us or law schools can keep up with. The recruiting market has changed. They're now, big law firms are now recruiting kids in their first year, often without even first year grades coming in. That is a terrible development. I've Lots of people have said that. I'm not the first. It's an absolutely terrible development. It's bad for the firms. It's bad for the law students. We finally got law schools to the point where the average age, at least at Penn where I went, is much older, and law students are coming in with a lot of work experience, which I think is excellent. They come in really knowing why they want to be lawyers, and now suddenly they're being recruited before they know if they even want to be litigators or corporate lawyers or T&E lawyers or labor lawyers. So I think that worries me, and it worries me that we're forcing young people, which is interplays with having kids, into making decisions without knowledge of what they really want to do with the rest of their lives. So I think it'll work out. I think there'll be a robust associate lateral market when kids figure out they went to the wrong place. But I don't think the recruiting trends are helpful. And I think when you look at AI, it has consequences that we can't predict that are going to shake out into the talent market. And firms are worried. I'm not the only person worried about it. You talk to law firm leaders, and I spend time talking to them. They're really worried about it. How many associates should they have? What should they teach them? What should they want from them when they arrive?
As you know, if you're a law firm leader, you make decisions on your associate class 3, 4, 5 years ahead, and you're trying to predict what the shape of the business is going to be. And to your point, the speed of the AI coming on stream is changing so incredibly fast. I don't know how you balance those two things if you're a law firm leader in today's marketplace.
I agree. And I think the way you just phrased it, if you sat down with law firm leaders who are being honest, they would also say they don't know. And we know a lot of the same people. When you speak to them privately, they're worried about it. And we have law firm chairs and ex-law firm chairs on the advisory board with me of my law school, and they're very concerned. They're not thoughtless. If anything, they're the most thoughtful people in the legal industry. They think deeply. They're pyramid models, but they're not interested in associates who leave after their 5th, 6th, 7th year and can't do anything. The whole model was built, I think I'm an example of it, on some people make partner, many leave and go on to do other things. Well, how do we even know how many 7th years will be needed from the class of 2026 that's about to graduate? Right? And if you look at the summer numbers, the law firms are all over the place, how many they're taking. And what happens to those associates? And it trickles down across in-house. What happens when in-house takes AI and is able to do work it used to send to law firms?
Chris and I were talking about how if you are a coder, engineering coding, and all of a sudden within the next 2 years, now it's almost becoming superfluous, where you don't have to kind of go to college to learn how to code. And as you said, you kind of did it over the kitchen table over a weekend. It's changing so fast.
It's changing so fast that even people in it. I had a conversation at Legal Week with someone who also sold a business to Thomson Reuters 20 odd years ago, who's technical, who's involved with a startup, who said to me, yeah, the code we wrote 6 months ago may not be relevant at all. The entire product suite may be irrelevant because it can now be done differently, or anyone can bolt it in. He wasn't saying it was irrelevant, but the idea that someone who was at a startup was acknowledging that what his team had done may be out of date 6 months after it was done. And we were chatting before we started about, I sat down to vibe code an app only because I thought I was the last person who hadn't done it. And I thought, like, let me see what this is. And I didn't really understand what it was. But to watch an AI tool take instructions and explain to me what it was doing, and then it took a little work, but not a lot for someone who's, adept with a computer, not adept at code. I've never coded, to figure out, okay, now to start understanding the language and what this terminology meant. And I'm 56 years old. So, law students today presumably are much more adept at this, but what does it mean for coders? What does it mean for engineering teams? We met a company at Legal Week that they have basically the founder who does the front end. They have engineers who aren't writing code. They're using AI to write code. And then the whole back end, all of the customer support, all of the lead gen, all of the agents to talk, it's all artificial intelligence. The entire backend, all the finance, all that is all done by artificial intelligence. So it's a company that probably 18 months ago would have needed to be 50 people. There are 7 or 8 of them, right? And that's kind of becoming the norm now, where the bots are getting so good. We tested a bot to answer calls. It was fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. And then you read how these things were trained. Now they're training themselves because they've got enough knowledge of inflection and tone that they can teach themselves. There goes the call center.
Yeah.
I just say I can't wait for my bot to talk to Chris's bot. That'd be fantastic.
Yes, right. Your avatars.
Exactly right.
But it's really it's a time of dislocation. So I think it presents lots of opportunity, but it keeps me up at night insofar as we are in a moment where the transformation that's coming is so obvious to all of us, but the consequences of it are far less obvious.
Understood.
So we just don't know. And we're trying to plan. You're a law firm leader. How do you plan for your class size? How do you plan for recruiting when the implications, you don't know what your client's going to do for your clients that have big in-house departments, and you don't know what your associates are going to be doing in, forget 5 years, next year, 2 years.
Maybe 6 months.
Right, maybe 6 months. The rate of change, the rate of acceleration is so fast. And the technology is becoming so good that we can't predict.
It's really funny. Walking around at Legal Week, David, I was struck by everyone's sort of on the same page that the velocity within the industry has substantially changed. There used to be some seasonality or a little bit of downtime, but I think together with a white hot legal market, technology coming on, in the robustness of the technology, private capital, it's all causing kind of a perfect storm about what's happening in the industry. And everyone's trying to cope in the way that they can, but it's causing a lot of decision making that has never happened at this speed before.
I agree. And people don't necessarily know where to turn for the best advice. I think there are people who would be useful advisors, but I think entrepreneurs often don't know where to turn, or they're making decisions very, very quickly, and they're either not getting advice or they're getting advice that isn't necessarily optimal. So we said earlier, or I said earlier, I think the valuations, I think this rise in valuation is not helpful. I get it. If you're an entrepreneur, you don't, be better to sell a business and own more of it than less of it. But I don't know, Howard, how do you take a business? Let's look at a Harvey that's now valued over $11 billion, right? And there's price compression already in the marketplace, right? So there's a giant banner that says trusted by over half the AmLaw 100, I think it was. Okay. So if you're in over half the AmLaw 100, now you'll acknowledge if they're not fully penetrated. But if you're already at half of them, and some number are not going to buy because there are competitors, right? There's Legora and there's lots of other, and there's already price compression. How do you then grow the business so that it supports a valuation significantly in excess of $11 billion? Maybe you can. I'm not saying you can't. I'm just saying that's a lot of pressure for a privately held business when no one wants to do a down round or a flat round.
And it might have to be a playbook from like Elon that shifts the whole business model to eventually owning a law firm or something like that, where it evolves.
Right. Or buying up other players. There's another business, Chris, that's kind of bills itself as a native AI law firm. And they've gone out and plucked off a bunch of ALSPs. So what they're really doing is they're sort of buying their way into clients they've got a very high multiple. I call it an 80x multiple. If you can buy businesses at, even at 15x, but in some of these cases you buy distressed assets at less than that, you could do that. And that is a model. And then you try to grow from there. I still worry that we're going to have a shakeout. You're certainly going to have a shakeout of legacy businesses. A lot of the legacy contract lifecycle management businesses are going to go away because frankly because of Anthropic. They'll just go away because people who've already bought Claude will figure out how to use it, and it's going to be deemed safe and it's going to be secure, and they won't get fired for using Anthropic. But on the litigation side, there'll be a lot of tools that also aren't necessary, niche tools that you can do with one of the big platform providers. So, oddly, I'm less worried about Thomson Reuters and Lexis, which their stock got clobbered over. And I thought, well, they're actually still the safest bets. They're good companies. They're embedded. Westlaw's embedded. Lexis is embedded, and they come with a lot of AI. So I think they'll be okay.
So, David, you ever kind of sit back and say, where you started with Pangea 3, and then you're talking about companies that have a valuation of 80x in the legal space. Do you kind of say, like, job done? I mean, because it's been an amazing arc that, where you started and where the industry is today, you wouldn't recognize it.
I don't say that. In part because I think I'm still trying to, prove to my kids that I'm not irrelevant and a dinosaur, which I say it jokingly, but I do think for people who sold a business, all of us always want to see what the next thing is. So to the extent it was code, it's certainly not going to be an expertise I have, but to the extent it's the use of code in transforming the legal industry, and that's what I did. I wasn't an outsourcing expert either, but I partnered with someone who was. And so I think it's an incredibly exciting time to be part of the legal industry. In some ways, I think we were a year or two early with Pangea 3, and we managed to survive because our investors forced us to become profitable in 2008. Right at the moment there was no capital to be raised, we had to become profitable. But I think it's a lot more exciting to be in legal today than it was 20 years ago when, reflexively people were slamming the door in our face. The idea that you would try to innovate in law was so foreign. So I don't in any way think the job is done. I'm more excited. My wife said to me when I came back, she said, whatever goes on at these things, I was probably hanging out with you, Howard, and you, Chris, like in the hall. Whatever's going on, it's really good for you because you come back energized and you feel good. I said, I think there's just amazing things happening. And sometimes it's that I'm watching people who worked with me or for me doing incredible things and thriving and succeeding and changing. It's gratifying to watch someone. We were at the event, last week, where there was a panel and there was an in-house person on the panel, Howard, the event we were at jointly, where we hired him at Pangea 3 when he was 20 and a law student. And to see him now be this sort of, he's not an elder statesman, but he's a, well thought of in-house legal operations expert at a massive public company that, I knew him when he was 20 years old, and he was a rock star at the time. And to see that career, that's really gratifying. So I think it keeps, at least for me and people like me, keeps me fresh and energized.
David, again, I think this is an extraordinary opportunity to have you on the show. I think you have a really unique perspective on the industry from the capital, but even building and selling businesses within legal services. I would love for you to share advice to our audience. And what I'll ask you to do is address law firm managing partners. What advice would you give them with everything we've discussed today? Probably some misunderstandings about capital, but how should they be thinking when things are changing so fast? What advice would you give them?
I think it's the same advice I give to everyone, and I would take a page from some of the law firm leaders that I most admire, and I spend time with some former heads of firms and some current, is to be incredibly curious and to ask questions. And I think most of the better ones ask them of their partners, and the really great ones go out in the market. And if they go to coffee, the really good ones will spend an hour trying to ask me questions about what I'm seeing. And I think that's a unique skill. And I've tried to adopt that, but to ask questions, what impact is this having? What are we hearing about the technology? What are we hearing about the labor market? What are we hearing about capital? Because I think that curiosity, leads to hearing different perspectives. There's no one right answer. I listened to a podcast and the person made a prediction about 3 to 5 AmLaw 200 equity deals in 2026. I don't agree with that, but I called him and asked him why he thought so. And the fascinating answer, he said, I think the sovereign wealth funds are going to get into this. Okay. Okay. Now, I have an opinion on that, but I picked up the phone and asked him, where do you come up with that number? Because to do that, you need, in many cases, $1 billion or more. Where's that coming from? And okay, sovereign wealth fund. So I was curious about it. So I think have curiosity. And if you want to understand how capital thinks in different ways, talk to us, talk to Burford. We're an open book about how we think about investments. We've made them, what permanent capital does and how it behaves versus capital that wants an exit, right? Talk to private equity that is a primary private equity investor versus a secondary. There are different types of private equity. So there are private equity shops, I'm on the board of a company, class action settlement administrator. Their private equity investor makes primary investments. They tend to make platform investments. They buy companies and they bolt on companies, and then they sell, and their buyers of those companies are traditionally companies that are in the secondary. They will buy from private equity companies, much more established, larger businesses. So ask questions. What's it like taking money from one versus the other? They're all different. Their capital is not all equal because it comes from people and it comes from businesses.
David, please finish the sentence. The future is bright because
we're in a moment of massive transformation, which by definition provides opportunity. And if you're willing to be curious, to ask questions, to challenge the status quo, we can turn the legal business and the legal profession into something extraordinary that helps clients, that helps businesses. We haven't talked about individuals, but that actually can radically change access to justice and the ability of consumers to access the legal market in ways they've never been able to access it before. It's the same things that keep me up at night, make me absolutely convinced that the future is bright.
Excellent. David, how can people follow you on social media?
the easiest place is always LinkedIn.
Excellent.
And you can certainly find me on the web, but LinkedIn's the easiest port of call.
Excellent. David, it's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you for your time today.
Thank
Appreciate
you
it,
so
David.
much,
Thank you.
Brett, Howard. This has been great. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here.